Mitch Horowitz is the host of the New Thought channel series One Simple Idea. He is a PEN Award-winning historian and the author of a number of books, including Occult America, which we sold out of last night, One Simple Idea, How Positive Thinking Reshaped Modern Life, Mind as Builder, The Positive Mind Metaphysics of Edgar Cayce, and the forthcoming Miracle Club, How Thoughts Become Reality. Mitch has written on everything from The Secret Life of Ronald Reagan to The War on Witches for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Salon, Politico, Time. He's the voice of popular audiobooks, including Raven, the definitive account of the Jonestown Massacre, which is now in production as an HBO miniseries, Alcoholics Anonymous, the Jefferson Bible. Mitch has discussed alternative spirituality on CBS's Sunday Morning, Dateline, NBC, CNN, and throughout the national media. A longtime publishing executive, Mitch has published authors current and past, including David Lynch and Manly Hall. Mitch is a good friend of ours. My predecessor, Dr. Harris, wrote a number of books, and Mitch published those and wrote one of the most beautiful introductions I've ever seen, a very heartfelt and powerful introduction to Dr. Harris's The Simple Road. He's our good friend. This is his first visit here in a long time. We've already talked. He's coming back as often as we can get him here. Please welcome Mitch Horowitz.
Thanks, man. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. It has been a long day, a lot of back-to-back interviews and different events here on campus, and Greg said that he was worried, I was kind of feeling tired, but then he popped his head into one of the rooms where I was giving an interview, and he said, "You were talking about hell and kind of waving your hands, so I knew you were okay." So, yes, everything's fine. I do want to start this evening's program on a note that is a somber one. I heard the tragic news earlier, as some of you may have heard, of the death last night of publisher Adam Parfrey, who was a great friend to all things occult and esoteric. And Adam's untimely death at age 61 leaves a tremendous gap in our culture. He was one of the most adventurous publishers of the late 20th, early 21st century, and he published books by figures ranging from Anton LaVey and Blanche Barton on topics including Satanism and the black metal scene in Scandinavia. The book Lords of Chaos is a real classic of its kind and is being made into a movie which is up for release very, very soon. He published, of course, a biography of Manly P. Hall, Master of the Mysteries, and the list that Adam created at Farrell House was a list that just expanded the boundaries of our intellectual culture and our thought, and he will be very, very deeply missed, and the books that he left behind are a tremendous, tremendous legacy and testament to the esoteric search. The theme of tonight's talk is The Miracle Club, which is the title of a book that I have coming out. And it's a book I've wanted to write for a very, very long time because it is a very practical book about the uses and agencies of the mind. And it very directly addresses the question, I think a question that probably exists within all of our hearts: are thoughts causative? Do our thoughts actually concretize and actualize in outer life? And it's my deep conviction and commitment at this time in my own search to explore that question and to explore it to its absolute limits with as much depth and maturity and seriousness as possible. as I was discussing last night, I think we all have the legacy and the opportunity and the responsibility to search without prejudice, without pre-conviction. And our search is this wonderful, precious, intimate thing. You don't need anyone's permission to explore the boundaries of your own abilities and capacities as a spiritual seeker. You don't need to disclose to anyone what you're doing. You don't need to pay dues to anyone. You don't need to put a label on yourself, and you don't need to ask anyone's permission. And I think, in fact, all the esoteric philosophies, all the occult philosophies that have circulated throughout the Western world since the great occult revival in Europe and America, starting in the mid to late 19th century, all of them seem to come down to this one question of whether our thoughts are an agency of true creation, of actualization, whether we serve as capillaries, as channels for some sort of higher principle, or some sort of channel of extra-physical agency and power. I've wrestled very heavily with this question, and I can point to all kinds of different testimonies, stories, studies in fields ranging from particle physics to placebo studies to neuroplasticity to branches of cognitive psychology to defend the idea that thoughts are causative, but ultimately, none of that is going to be as convincing as your own personal, private, intimate experience. And that's really what I want to talk about tonight. What I'd like to do tonight is say a few words about my own journey into mind metaphysics and offer you some ideas and suggestions for things that you can use right now, in the here and now, to conduct your own experiments. The term the Miracle Club refers to a little salon of occult seekers that gathered together in New York City in the mid-1870s. The Miracle Club was the immediate precursor to the Theosophical Society. It included Madam H.P. Blavatsky, Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, Major General Abner Doubleday, Thomas Edison, and other New Yorkers who were interested in coming together in the post-Civil War period and just asking the question, what is out there? What is out there? They were a very short-lived organization, but they later gave birth to the larger and more influential Theosophical Society, whose influence spread across the world. But I love the informality of the original Miracle Club. I love the fact that they were just a small cluster of people who came together to search in the areas of ESP and clairvoyance and spiritualism without prejudice and with a sense of adventure. And so, in calling tonight's talk the Miracle Club, I suppose what I'm really doing is I'm inviting all of you to consider yourselves part of this same experiment. We're all speaking and we're all gathering tonight as co-seekers. And I want to share some ideas with you as directly and as bluntly as I possibly can that I hope will be useful in your own life. I think there exists within the spiritual search a certain polarity. And the polarity is, am I trying to see through my own thoughts and plans and aspirations in the world, or am I trying to dissolve that sense of self-seeking in hopes of being occupied by some other kind of divine influx or higher realization that goes beyond my individual wants and needs? It could be put this way. Is the purpose of the spiritual search, thy will be done? Or is the purpose of the spiritual search, my will be done? I've wrestled very mightily with that question. And I take that question very seriously. And I won't tolerate in myself answers to that question that seem spiritually sound or traditionally right. I need to answer that question for myself, as you need to answer that question for yourself, without being spoon-fed or dictated to what the answer is. I will tell you the answer that I found for myself, not because I think you should have the same answer, and not because I think you should agree with me, but just because we are co-seekers. We are co-seekers, and we share testimony with one another. And I'll share with you, very plainly, the answer that I came to, which you may find fortifying and helpful and encouraging, or which you may reject and feel that your answer lay in a different place. And I honor that. Years ago, I knew and worked with someone who was fairly well known nationally as a psychic. And I believe that she had a very genuine psychic gift. I believe she really did have a power of intuition that went beyond the ordinary. I think she did possess some capacity of higher sight. But I didn't really like her as a person, quite frankly, because I felt she also had a kind of violent quality about her. Not physically violent, but she had a tendency to kind of push people around, to get her way in a very aggressive manner, to intimidate people. And so I was always divided between being close to her as a friend, but also wanting to keep my distance. And one night, she and I were having a conversation in a parking lot somewhere, and in the middle of the conversation, she stopped and she said to me, "Do you know what you want? You want power, but you have an overdeveloped superego, and that's your problem." And for years, this must go back 15, 18 years ago, for years, I wanted to push that away. I wanted to push that away because I thought to myself, well, you know, I don't want power like you have it, lady. I don't bully people. I don't intimidate people. I don't push and shove. No way. And I really, really pushed what she said away from me. But it haunted me. It haunted me. It would always come back to me. Perhaps over the course of years, I would think about it maybe every day or every other day. You know, the way a memory, an indelible memory, something that happened to you maybe when you were very young, always comes back to you, comes back to you. And eventually, and quite recently, I had to come to terms with her statement, because whether or not I liked her as an individual was irrelevant. I felt that she did have real insight. And there came a time in life, not long ago, where I realized that she was right. She was telling me the truth. It was something I had to acknowledge to myself. But I didn't want power in some manner that was bossy and pushing and shoving and aggressive. Not at all. The kind of power that I wanted and that I felt was intrinsic in her statement was the ability to see through my plans in the world, the ability to have a vision and to carry through that vision absent some dramatic countervailing force. And I have to tell you, a great deal of peace came to me with this acknowledgement and this realization. Again, I don't want to be anybody's boss. I'd be a terrible boss, you know. But power as defined by the capacity to set forth a personal ethical goal or project, whatever it is and whatever it may be, and to act with a sense of direct agency to see through those plans in the world, that to me is power of a noble sort. And that to me, I came to realize, is what I personally was really looking for in the spiritual search. Is that what you're looking for? I can't say. Only you can answer that question in your own heart. But I think that's what probably moved me years ago, before I could really come to that acknowledgement. That's what probably moved me towards this field of mind metaphysics, by which I mean the principle that thoughts are causative. I wrote a whole book on the topic called One Simple Idea, where I evaluated the positive mind thesis. Where did it come from? What effects has it had? What expressions have been good and sound? What expressions have been questionable? And I found, as I was writing that book, it's probably my personal favorite of everything that I've written, but I found that as I was writing that book, I was still caught in this internal tug of war. My will be done or thy will be done? And I would try to marry those two ideas. I would try to tell myself that such a duality is artificial, but it didn't settle the tug of war. There were two figures in the mind metaphysics world, very different, very distinctive, very powerful, to whom I grew attached. And they both presented different paths. And I want to describe these two figures. Maybe in my descriptions of them, you will recognize your own search. Maybe one of these two figures will become a source of instruction and inspiration to you. Or maybe my description of these two figures will induce in you this decade-long internal tug of war that I found in myself. There are two figures who I write about in my book, One Simple Idea. And they both, very loosely speaking, come out of the tradition of mind metaphysics. One is a man named Vernon Howard. Not a very well-known figure, but an extraordinary and dramatically unclassifiable and original thinker who lived most of his life in Southern California, here in LA, and eventually relocated to Boulder City, Nevada, where he lived for about 2 decades, writing and speaking to a small and dedicated group of about 60 students, and where he died in 1992. And Vernon was this extraordinarily dynamic and unclassifiable figure who began his writing career in the 40s, 50s, early 60s, more or less operating in the field of business motivation, positive thinking, thought power, written for a popular audience. But around the year 1966, Vernon had a kind of spiritual awakening. And he came to feel that our participation in outer life, our striving in our careers, in our jobs, in our homes, was choking us off from our true nature, from our authentic selves. And Vernon came to feel that running through the mystical thought of all religious traditions was this need, as Christ put it, to be in the world but not of it. And he felt that the path to self-awareness was a kind of radical nonconformity, where no longer would you as the individual worship at the altar of personal success, of financial or artistic striving, of defining yourself by whatever role or label life wants to put on you, parent, doctor, professor, nurse, professional, accountant, whatever. And that you needed to almost have a contempt for outer life. Forget about all the awards and goodies of outer life. Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of pottage, and that's what we do every day, Vernon came to feel, when we sacrifice ourselves to the goodies and the rewards and the approval that we seek in outer life. So, he withdrew from LA. He withdrew from his career as a writer, journalist, moved. He went through a divorce. He went through different changes in his life. It's not necessarily related to his philosophy, but it coincided with it. Moved to Boulder City, Nevada, at the time a very rural place. And years later, he told a reporter from the Los Angeles Times that, he sought a career as a writer, and he found that he would get applause for his writing, he would get approval for his writing, but then the applause would go away, and he would want more, and he would sink into a deep depression. And he said he was just constantly on this roller coaster, and he just said, I'm getting off the roller coaster. And while he was living in Boulder City, he went through a period of tremendous creativity, wrote many wonderful, wonderful books and pamphlets, sometimes with very sensationalistic titles, like The Mystic Path to Cosmic Power and Esoteric Mind Power. And people always wondered, why did Vernon use such lurid, sensationalistic titles? And I could never quite figure out why, and I never met the man. Had I met him, I would have asked him. But I think he was desirous of speaking to a broad public, but only on his own terms. Only on his own terms. And his books were wonderful, models of clarity. He gave lectures on a public access cable TV channel, and you can find many of them on YouTube. And you'll be astonished at how he could speak without an or an without a pause, without a note in front of him. And he would give these marvelous discourses on the importance of nonconformity, the importance of cultivating your own inner light, the importance of separating from the world. And he had these wonderful, wonderful, simple insights. Here's one of the most powerful of them. It's so simple that people would overlook it. People would overlook it. But listen to this carefully. one night he was speaking to a room of students, and he sometimes had a very aggressive style. And he sort of raised his voice, almost yelling at the people in the room, and he said, "What I'm really trying to tell you is, why don't you just leave people alone? They don't need your jokes or your smart remarks. They've got problems of their own." But think of that principle, how beautiful it is. Think of it. Leave people alone. One of the great fractures of human nature is this desire that we have to tell other people what to do. You see this all the time on social media. People come along and they say, "Well, I don't think you should be giving a talk on such and such. I don't think you should be doing this." And it's never enough for them to be heard. They don't want to be heard. They want to be obeyed. That's why we get into fights on social media. They want to be obeyed. David Orr, the wonderful artist in residence here, was telling me the other night about one spiritual organization that was suing another spiritual organization. Of course, what could be a more beautiful expression of the transcendent? And, as we were discussing this, I said to him, they could just leave them alone. There's always that option. People who commit acts of violence against other people. You could just leave them alone. Think of it. Think of how it could change your life. Think of how it could improve the life of everyone around you if we all just let people alone. So Vernon could say these things, and they could strike somebody who was listening in a lazy way as very ordinary, but if somebody was really listening as if for dear life, such a simple statement could be life-changing. Now, as I mentioned, Vernon had a habit of raising his voice, and he had sort of a gruff style. So sometimes in the car, I'd be listening to his CDs, and my kids couldn't imagine why I was listening to this man. And one of them took one of my notebooks once and wrote in it, "Vernon Howard is mean." And I said, he's not mean. He's trying to help people. But Vernon did have this very kind of booming speaking style. And, sometimes I would make the mistake, which we all make, of turning off the car and forgetting to turn the audio system off. So, then you turn the car back on and the radio or the CD comes booming loud and shocks everybody in the car. And there was one night where Vernon was saying something, I don't even remember what it was, but it was the middle of a talk, and I turned the ignition key of the car on, and my kid's in the back, and Vernon's voice comes out of the speaker saying, "And it's gonna be terrible!" And so now for the rest of their lives, they won't listen to Vernon Howard. And Vernon also made this observation. He made this observation. He said, never, never, never allow yourself, when you are faced with a situation where somebody's not giving you what you want, maybe not returning a phone call or returning an email, or somebody's withholding something from you that you're seeking professionally or financially, never, 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 he warned, make the mistake of saying, "Well, I'll make my way in the world, and then they'll see, they'll be sorry. Because he said, as soon as you do that, you're completely buying in to the world's values. As soon as you do that, you are Esau, selling off your birthright for a bowl of pottage. You're saying that your values are the same as the values of the people who are irritating you. You are abandoning the search for transcendent values." And so his message was really one of a kind of primeval, mystical Christianity. Don't be of the world. Don't conform. Don't obey the strictures of the world. And ultimately, he could use very Christian language. And he spoke of the need to be born again. And he would talk of this very plainly and very directly. How? What's the method? How do we do this? How do we live from this place of transcendent values? His formula was simply just stop. Stop your thoughts. Stop your strivings. Stop your complaining. Stop bothering other people. Stop telling other people what to do. Just stop. God is all around you. It's like an influx that's just waiting to come into you as soon as you open the door. Now, I went through a period of time, and as you can tell from my description, I love this man. He was a great, great thinker, and I love this man. I went through a period of time where I was reading Vernon's books and pamphlets and listening to his talks every single day because they are like a tonic. They are like a tonic for the soul. And they become a kind of companion to you. And he wrote and he spoke with such exquisite simplicity that every time you heard his message, it was like you were hearing it for the first time. And I felt and continue to feel, as I think the manner in which I'm speaking of him attests, a very deep love for him and a very deep love for his teachings. At the same time, as I was reading and really absorbing Vernon's ideas, I was also absorbing the ideas of another figure who we discussed briefly last night, and that is Neville Goddard, someone who also came loosely from the mind metaphysics tradition. Neville was a British Barbadian who was born in the West Indies in 1905, and at the age of 17, he traveled to New York City to study theater. It was a very different time. You know, today, nobody can figure out how to get their kids out of their basement, and here this guy journeys from the island of Barbados to Manhattan all on his own at the age of 17. And he studied theater. He was a dancer, and he did attain some success. He had roles on the Broadway stage. He traveled with a dance troupe in the United States and Europe. He appeared in some movies, some silent movies. There was one critic who referred to him as the new Valentino, the new Valentino. He never really became the new Valentino, but he was an enormously handsome man, beautifully, beautifully spoken. He had this mid-Atlantic accent. He would speak with this wonderful British clip in his voice, entirely self-educated. And starting in the early 1930s, his interest in theater and the stage began to fade, and he grew interested more and more in metaphysics. And he said, as he tells it, in 1933, he met this mysterious, turbaned man, a black man of Jewish descent named Abdullah, who he studied with for 5 years, studying scripture, Hebrew, Kabbalah, number symbolism, and probing the secrets and uses of the mind. And as Neville described it, one winter he was aching to journey back to his home island of Barbados, but he had absolutely no money to travel. And he was very ashamed. He has said, I made money in theater 1 year, and I would spend it the next, and I was a failure in my own eyes. I was embarrassed to see my family. I yearned to visit them and to spend Christmas on the island of Barbados, but I had no money and no means to get there. And he described this as the turning point of his life, because Abdullah used this as a teaching moment. And he said to him, Neville, you are to live and walk and eat and sleep and drink and breathe as though you are in the island of Barbados, and so you shall be. And Neville said in the winter of 1933, he walked the icy, slushy streets of Manhattan, imagining that he was walking the coconut tree-lined lanes of his little home island of Barbados. And time passed, a week passed, another week passed, nothing happened. And he went back to Abdullah and he said, "Ab, this just isn't working for me." And Abdullah said to him, "I can't hear you, Neville. You're not here. You're in Barbados." And he slammed the door in his face. And Neville said he continued to walk the streets, imagining, sleeping, waking as if he was in Barbados. And then one day, before the last ship was to depart from Manhattan to the island of Barbados, Neville said he received a special telegram from his older brother, Victor, and inside was $50 and a first-class steamship ticket to Barbados, completely out of the blue, without any overt or outer action on his behalf. Now, when you hear a story like that, it's easy to think, oh, come on, you're making this up. But I grew very enamored of Neville. And like Vernon, he had that capacity, again, to speak at great length. You can find his lectures online. He allowed them to be freely recorded during his lifetime. To speak at great length, without a note, without a pause, without hesitation. To write with this elegant simplicity. And to promulgate this one idea which he came to at the culmination of his studies with Abdullah. And the idea is this: your imagination is God. Your imagination is God. And God the Creator in the Old and New Testament is nothing other than an allegory of the human imagination. Not a single event in Scripture, he maintained, is historically true. All of it is an allegory of your own internal development, which will culminate in your crucifixion, which is to say your realization that you are God clothed in human flesh, and that everything that you see, that you experience, that you relate to, is your own emotionalized thought and mental pictures pushed out into the world. And he meant this in the most literal sense. In other words, Neville would say, and I address this to each person in this room individually, there's no Mitch here. These words that you're hearing are your words. I am not here. I am rooted in you, as you are ultimately rooted in God. This is your message. And the only reason you're hearing this right now is because you've come to this place of realization, and I'm just a mental picture of yours that's dispensing this message, a message that comes from you. You are God. Your imagination is God the Creator. And the Old and New Testament is a mystical allegory of your own development. I am rooted in you. Scripture is rooted in you, is your story. Neville meant this in the most literal sense. I researched Neville's life because he was a very mysterious figure. He didn't cultivate publicity. He was enormously handsome, but allowed very few photographs to be taken of him. He self-published most of his own books, and again, he freely allowed anybody to tape his lectures. Tape recording technology didn't become widely available until the late 1960s, and Neville died in 1972. But he gave thousands of lectures over the course of his life. So many hundreds of these lectures, primarily those that he gave in the late 60s, early 70s, but some earlier, are all online. You go type the name Neville Goddard into Google, you'll never be able to stop listening. Think of it, in an age like ours, where everybody every so-called spiritual teacher, can't wait to trademark or copyright stuff and has their beautiful, professionally taken photographs and their HTML newsletter and is constantly selling you up on experiences and has some organization at their back. Neville was a figure who was just like an itinerant minister. He would just show up from place to place, allow everyone and anyone to tape and freely circulate his lectures. Virtually everything he wrote is in public domain. The copyrights were never renewed. His daughter, Victoria, lives in Los Angeles. She seems to take a very hands-off approach to everything. I've written to Victoria. I've tried to reach her. She doesn't respond. But then I published an anthology of Neville's work, and she gave her permission for its publication, and she said, "Good luck with the book." That's the only communication I've ever heard from her. She's just like her father. So I began researching Neville's life, and he would tell these stories that were really quite hard to believe, but they turned out to be true. He was drafted into the army during the Second World War, and he desperately did not want to be in the army because he had just gotten married and he had a young daughter, and he was in his late 30s. He was a little old to be drafted. You could be drafted, I think, up until about the age of 43 at that time. It was at the height of the Second World War. And he was in boot camp training in Louisiana. And as he described it in his lectures, he was really desperate to get out of the army. He had left his wife and his newborn daughter, Victoria, at home at their apartment building in Greenwich Village on Washington Square West. And he wanted no part of the army, and he felt he was too old to be there, and he really wanted to get out. And so he went to his commanding officer, and he asked for a discharge, and the commanding officer said, "Absolutely not. Of course not." And so Neville claimed in his lectures that he would go to bed every single night, visualizing, picturing, imagining himself back in his apartment in Greenwich Village, every single night. And he did this for several weeks. And to his great shock and surprise, his commanding officer summoned him to his office, and he said to him, "Goddard, do you still want a discharge?" And he said, "Yes, very much." And he said, "Fine, you're free to go." And I read this in one of Neville's lectures, and I said, I simply can't believe that. This was at the height of the Second World War. Yes, he was old for a draftee, but remember, Neville was a dancer. He was probably in perfect shape physically. He remained slender and athletic his entire life. There's just no way, it struck me, that the Army would have just suddenly given Neville a discharge. So I began to research his life, and I found his original draft papers, found where he was stationed at Camp Polk in Louisiana, and found, sure enough, at the height of the Second World War, 4 months after Neville was drafted, he was honorably discharged from the Army. Honorably discharged. And the discharge papers said he was discharged because he had to pursue a vital civilian occupation. So I contacted an officer in the Army's Public Affairs Office to talk this over, and I described the situation to him. He must have been thrilled to hear from me. And I said, now, this man was a metaphysical lecturer. Why would he have been discharged from the military at the height of the Second World War to pursue what his discharge papers call a vital civilian occupation? He was a metaphysical lecturer. And the officer promised he would check it out, and he wrote back to me and he said, well, unfortunately, Mr. Goddard's records were destroyed in a fire in 1973, 1 year after his death, at the Army's Special Records Center in Georgia. And that's all the information we have. All that remained from the fire was his final payslip indicating the date of his discharge, honorable discharge, about 4 months after he was inducted into the Army. And that September, in September of 1943, there was a profile of Neville in all places, in the New Yorker magazine, not a magazine known for its occult proclivities, describing him back in town, speaking in Greenwich Village, speaking at the Actors Church in Midtown. And it was a somewhat tongue-in-cheek profile, but maybe one of the only profiles of a mystical figure like Neville ever written in the New Yorker, but confirming that there he was, back in Greenwich Village, speaking uptown, speaking downtown. I found a lot of episodes like that in Neville's life. I write about him in One Simple Idea and other places, where he would make these claims that seemed absolutely outlandish, and I can't tell you what happened, but I can tell you that the logistics of what he described hold up. But his Army discharge papers were destroyed in a fire 1 year after his death. Neville taught not only that your imagination is God and that everything that you experience is the result of your own emotional mental pictures pushed out, but he also taught that desire is sacred. Human desire is sacred. And he said that when you feel a yearning or a desire for something, whatever it is, that's God speaking to you. That's God speaking to you. And insofar as the God of Old and New Testament is this being of creation, so are you. So are you. And that desire should never be pushed away or compromised with. It should be fulfilled. It should be fulfilled. And if you use your imagination, so he taught, to fulfill desire, it would unfold in the right way, in the right time, as long as you didn't grasp for it in some excessive way. He didn't counsel passivity. He didn't counsel passivity. He said at certain moments, at certain times, you might feel induced to act upon a certain thing, to act in a certain way, and those might be seen as divine instructions. But he counseled a kind of exquisite patience. He said, just form the mental picture. Just form the mental picture. Live with it. Feel it. Live it in. Don't see yourself doing it as if it's up on a movie screen somewhere. Feel yourself doing it. He said, if I wanted to imagine myself climbing a ladder, I wouldn't see myself climbing a ladder as if I was watching it up on a screen somewhere. I climb. Feel those rungs in your hand. I'll share with you a little 3-step version of Neville's method that I boiled down. I'll get to that a little bit later. But Neville's teaching was that your wishes and your desires and the plans and the things that you want to see through in the world are divine, are sacred. They are not only your birthright, they are your royal road to self-realization. God didn't wrestle with the question of whether to create the earth. God created it. Christ didn't wrestle with the question of whether to create loaves and fishes or wine at the wedding or whether to walk on water. He did so. And so Neville taught that your desires, they're sacred, they're holy, they're expressive of your deepest nature. So, maybe you can understand the division that I felt within myself. Here are these two compelling, beautiful figures from the mind metaphysics tradition. One of them, Vernon Howard, speaks of the importance of non-aspiration, of non-attachment to the world and its goodies, of rejecting outright everything that the world seeks to dangle before us as rewards. And then on the other hand, here is Neville, who teaches just as explicitly, just as plainly, just as insistently, that your desires are sacred, that your desires are products of the innate creative nature that exists within your mind, that is, in fact, the very thing that men and women call God. And that each of us is God clothed in human flesh. And only as we realize our own innate divine powers of creativity do we reach a sense of awareness of ourselves as God the Creator, as Christ crucified and resurrected, as God the Heavenly Father, as God the Creator. I wrestled with these two different visions. I tried to tell myself that there's no real separation between these two. I tried to persuade myself that any separation between these two visions is artificial, that they could be harmonized. But I was not at peace with that. I was not persuaded of that. In my search, I came to feel, ultimately, that my personal fealty was to Neville's vision. I came to feel that human aspiration is sacred. That insofar as we are created in the image of the higher, insofar as we are created in the image of the Maker, so is it intrinsic in our lives that we be productive, that we be generative, that we be aspirational, that we be creative. I'm going to be very blunt with you because I feel I owe you that. If I'm correct that there's a division between thy will be done and my will be done, I chose my will be done. I came to feel, at least at this point in my search, that individual aspiration is sacred, that we are here to produce and to create. I also feel very strongly that our aspiration must be nonviolent, must be ethical. And I mean this. By nonviolent aspiration, I mean not doing anything that would violate another's capacity to develop his or her own self-potential. By not doing anything to stymie or limit or disrupt another individual's or another community's seeking of their own highest innate self-potential. How can one know that? How can one know that? I don't have ultimate perspective. I do things sometimes that hurt other people without intending to. Or I reach the end of my emotional or intellectual resources and I make a mistake. I think that's part of life too. But I do believe that we all have, from time to time, exquisitely sensitive moments where we really do see with a higher perspective. There will be lapses, there will be mistakes, there will be violations. But I do think that men and women are granted the ability at our most sensitive moments sometimes at moments of deep euphoria, or sometimes at moments of deep grief, sometimes at moments when the onrush of thoughts that travel through us momentarily stop. I do think we are granted experiences of higher perspective, where we actually truly can see what's going on around us and can formulate a sense of internal vision and purpose and aim, and do so in a manner that's non-violating of other individuals. Neville felt that if you picture something with deep and profound conviction, it will eventually unfold in a way that is natural and not fracturing of other people. And what about other people? If you are God and everyone's rooted in you, are there other people? Are there other people? Neville said that all of us are God clothed in human flesh, and all of our lives are these kind of self-imagined universes that crisscross infinitely with one another. We weave in and out of one another's experience. But the ultimate truth is that the creative faculty and the visualizing properties of everyone's mind is God, the Creator. I'm haunted by a passage from Carlos Castaneda's first book, Teachings of Don Juan, in which his sorcerer teacher, Don Juan, says that it's imperative that the individual choose a path with a heart. He said all paths are the same. They lead nowhere. So choose one with a heart and don't make yourself miserable. And I came to feel that Neville's path, for me, was the one with a heart. I came to feel I needed to stop this internal wrestling match, wondering whether my wishes and aspirations were correct, were spiritually sound, and instead embrace his principle. And I have to admit to you, it felt very relaxing. I felt a great sense of relief. I felt a wonderful respite from this deep wrestling match that existed within me. I'm not proposing that the place I've come to at this point in my search is the place that you need to come to, but we are here tonight as co-seekers, and I'm offering you my experience. And I also want to offer you an article of experimentation. I want to offer you my adaptation of Neville's method in 3 very, very simple steps that you can try yourself. Neville gave, as I mentioned, thousands of lectures. He wrote 10 books, each of them elegant, persuasive, simple, beautiful, in which he argued this most radical of ideas, that your imagination is God, with total persuasiveness and this beautiful effortlessness. And each time he restated the same basic thesis. But like Vernon Howard, he had the ability to restate this thesis with total freshness, as if you were hearing it for the first time. And I think his method can be boiled down to these 3 steps. And as Neville would say, test me, try it tonight. If it doesn't work, throw it out. Forget you ever heard from me. But if it does work, puts you in front of a very big question. So here's Neville's method, at least as I have boiled it down to these 3 steps. Here's the first step. You must possess a very keenly felt, deeply felt desire. And you must be absolutely frank and clear and plain with yourself about what this desire is. We think we know what we want, but we rarely examine that proposition because we tend to think from a place of habit. We tend to think from a place of vanity. We like to repeat things internally to ourselves that make us feel good or that at least help us avoid guilt, like, I'm a spiritual person. I don't care about money. I don't care about riches. I don't care about fame. I don't care about attention. Those things belong to the devil, not to good spiritual people like me. But what do you really want? What do you really, truly want in life? It's an exquisitely private question. Frankly, I don't think you should talk to anybody about it. Because when you talk to people about what you want, sometimes they push back in a very cynical way, or they judge you. Maybe it's not their business. Maybe it's not your spouse's business what you want. Maybe it's not your neighbor Mike's business what you want. Maybe when your uncle at Thanksgiving asks you a question, you should change the topic to the weather. Don't tell him what you want. You don't have to be judged. It's not everybody else's business. It's your life. It's your existence. But you do have to be very honest with yourself, which is why I told the story at the beginning of all the years I spent pushing away my old friend's proposition that what you really want is power. I don't know that I have an overdeveloped superego. I don't even know that there is such a thing called a superego. These are just words that we apply to experiences that we barely have any understanding of. But I do know that what she said to me had a certain indelible truth that haunted me. And I do know that there are some people who claim that money means nothing to them, whereas resources may be very, very personally important to them. And I do know that almost every artist wants an audience. Almost every thinker and writer wants a constituency. I remember years ago, I was in a spiritual group of seekers, very intellectually serious, very rigorous, and we would have these group meetings. And at one of these group meetings, there was a woman who spoke very eloquently and told the story of how one winter day she created an ice sculpture outside of her house. And it was one of these winter days in the Northeast where the afternoons could get very warm when the sun was high in the sky. And she noticed that the sun was rising high in the sky, and she was worried that her ice sculpture would melt before a group of friends came to visit her that afternoon. And she wanted her group of friends to see this ice sculpture that she had created. And she spoke in these almost confessional tones to the group of how she could feel this pull within her ego, that she was hoping her friends would hurry up and arrive before the afternoon sun melted her ice sculpture. And she spoke of this in almost tones of confession. And I was struck by her honesty, and I appreciated it, but at the same time I thought to myself, this woman has nothing to apologize for, nothing to confess to anyone. Because it struck me that what she did was create something beautiful. She made her world a more lovely, more beautiful place by creating this ice sculpture, something that I cannot do. And why shouldn't she want other people to behold that which she created. Aren't we told, don't hide your light under a bushel? Beauty should be seen. An act of creation should be witnessed. I was struck that this woman was entirely right to want her friends to see this beautiful thing that she had created. Why would you take something beautiful and stow it away somewhere in an attic where no other individual can see it and be moved by it? Her act of creativity was a testimony to life itself. So when I say to you, summarizing Neville's method, in this first of 3 steps, know what you want, I mean really know it. And don't feel any sense of hesitancy about it. And don't allow what you've heard or what you've been told or what you think someone else will think to take your desire away from you. So that is step 1. That is step 1. A clarified desire. Step 2. Enter a state of physical immobility. Enter a very, very relaxed, waking state. Neville talked about the importance of using those precious few moments that you experience very naturally just before you drift off to sleep at night. Sleep researchers today refer to that as the hypnagogic state. The hypnagogic state. It's a state of mind in which we experience a sense of surrealism. Things seem to bend and morph in our minds. Sometimes we have visions, or we experience kind of waking dreams. But we still have some modicum of control over our own awareness. We can still direct our thoughts. There were a series of psychical research, Esp Research Experiments, conducted by a very brilliant psychical researcher named Charles Honorton in the 1970s and 80s, called the Ganzfeld Experiments. The Ganzfeld Experiments. Ganzfeld is German for whole field or open field. And he discovered, and these were very carefully and deeply vetted experiments, you can read about them online or in textbooks of parapsychological research. Honorton discovered that when you induced people into a comfortable state of hypnagogia, maybe putting them into an isolation chamber, allowing them to recline in an easy chair, giving them white noise, headphones, eye shades, when you induce people into a state of very comfortable, relaxed hypnagogia, where they're not asleep, but their body is very still, they're very relaxed, all sensory data is stilled, they're in pitch darkness, they're comfortable. It proved to be, in his experiments, a heightened state for the occurrence of telepathic phenomena. In such experiments, he would place one person into a kind of isolation chamber with another person outside the chamber, and the person outside the chamber would try to mentally transmit a picture to the person in the chamber, and people who were induced into a relaxed state of hypnagogia consistently scored a higher degree of hits than if they were in a normal state. Sleep researchers are doing all kinds of work with these states of comfortable relaxation that we're in, just as we're drifting off to sleep at night, or just as we're coming to in the morning, which is sometimes called hypnopompia, but both states are very similar. We're very relaxed, very suggestible. Our emotional defenses are down. We're in a keen state of awareness, but the mind is very, very stilled and very, very supple. Neville taught that this is prime time to construct within our minds mental scenes and pictures of what we want. He's not the only person within the positive mind tradition who made this observation. It can be difficult for some people to meditate. It can be difficult for some people to still their minds and bodies. But what Neville taught is that you can use these natural moments just before you drift to sleep at night. Do it tonight. Do it tonight. As a kind of prime time for formulating mental pictures. And then the third and final step is formulate an image of what you want. Formulate a very, very specific image of what you want. For example, a woman at one of his Los Angeles lectures said to him that more than anything, she wanted to be married. So what should she do? And he would say, formulate a very, very simple scene, let's say, of a wedding band on your finger. Just feel the weight of the band on your finger. Maybe imagine what it would be like to twist this band of gold around on your hand. Feel its pressure gently on your finger. He would describe very, very simple scenes. Maybe if you wanted a promotion at work, imagine your boss shaking your hand in congratulations. And just run the scene through your head again and again. Very gently, very deftly, very naturally. Allow yourself to feel your hand flesh to flesh with another person's. Or maybe allow yourself to feel yourself holding an award in your hand, or receiving a diploma, or something that suggests the fulfillment of your desire. And run it through your mind. Run it through your mind as long as it feels natural and tactile and authentic. And then just allow yourself to naturally drift off to sleep. Allow yourself to naturally drift off to sleep. And then he said, there will be a natural gestation period, a period of delay between that which you want and its actual occurrence. And there will be periods where you feel disappointed. If you want to be in Paris and you wake up in the morning and you find yourself back in Queens, where I grew up, you may be disappointed, very understandably so. But give it time. Everything has its own natural period of gestation. Give it time. That's what could be called faith. And in its own natural time, in its own natural unfolding, the thing which you want will concretize, will harden into fact. An assumption, if persisted in, good or bad, will harden into fact. That was Neville's teaching. Is it true? I can certainly speak of circumstances in my life in which it is absolutely proven true. Sometimes at the most surprising and unexpected moments. Sometimes things that I imagined, dreamt of, thought of, pursued through this three-step method would come up in ways that would absolutely surprise me. Sometimes at a far distance from what I had imagined, and sometimes very, very soon thereafter. I'll tell you one quick story because I feel like I owe you a story from my own experience. In the summer of 2016, for reasons that I really was unsure about and can't quite explain, I began to get interested in the music of the old television band, the Monkees. And I was listening to the Monkees all the time. And my kids got to know their songs, and they knew the lyrics to I'm Not Your Stepping Stone. And I began to play the Monkees all the time. And one time I was sitting on Wikipedia with my younger son, and we were looking up all the different albums of the Monkees. I was reading biographies about their members. I have no idea why, but I was just struck by this curiosity with the Monkees. In October of that year, October of 2016, I took a sabbatical from my publishing job. I didn't really want to take a sabbatical. I was perfectly happy staying at work, but my company had been bought by Random House, and I was told that the corporate culture at Random House was we were all supposed to take sabbaticals and enrich ourselves, or else. So I thought, okay, I'll take a 30-day sabbatical and I'll enrich myself. So I had some writing to do, of course, and it's a German company. They do things like that, you know. So I took a sabbatical, and I attended to some articles and some other things that I had been planning on writing. And I was sitting at home one day in October of 2016, and I was thinking to myself, I need a new project. I need something new. I had completed some articles that I was on deadline to finish, and there was this short book on Edgar Cayce that I was planning to begin writing, but I wasn't quite ready to throw myself into the Cayce book yet, and I had just finished some articles that I was on deadline, and I was thinking, do you know what I want? I want a major publication to contact me, and I want them to offer me a really, really unique writing opportunity. And I really thought this. I'm not making this up, y'all. I feel very strongly that we in the spiritual culture should not be juicing up or embellishing our stories, or what are we? What are we? So I was sitting on the couch in our apartment on the east side of Manhattan, and I'm thinking to myself really, really vividly, I want a major publication to get in contact with me and give me a really unique writing assignment, because I needed something to occupy my energies. I was in this interval sort of period where I had finished one deadline. I wasn't ready to commence a new project. So that very day, hours later, I get an email from an editor at the Washington Post named Ron Charles, who said to me, one of our book review editors is trying to reach you, and your email isn't working. I just wanted to verify your email address. And I said, yes, this is the right email address. And he said, okay, this guy's going to be in touch with you. And he said to me, by the way, are you friends in any way with any member of the Monkees? And I said, no, I'm not. And he said, did you know that Mike Nesmith from the Monkees, Mike is the smart monkey, Davey's the cute one, Peter's the weird one, Mickey's the funny one, Mike is the smart one. And he said, did you know Mike Nesmith from the Monkees is a Christian Scientist? And I said, no, I didn't know that. And he said, do you know Mike Nesmith? And I said, no, I don't know Mike Nesmith. And he said, well, Nesmith has a memoir coming out, and we want you to review it. And I said, no fucking way. No, I said, well, of course. And I said, I'd be delighted. And so they FedEx overnight a copy of Mike Nesmith's memoir to me, and it's called Infinite Tuesday. And Nesmith is a really interesting metaphysical thinker, very, very smart guy, comes from a family of Christian Scientists. I bet some of you know this. His mother invented liquid paper. And they're very proud of this in the Christian Science Church. And his mother actually did feel that the metaphysical teachings of Mary Baker Eddy had amped up her creativity in a certain way, so that she went from being a secretary in Dallas, Texas, to inventing and patenting liquid paper, and it made the Nesmith family very wealthy, as a matter of fact. And Mike Nesmith himself did a lot of extraordinary things. And one of the things he talked about in the book, Infinite Tuesday, which I highly recommend and which is a very good book, is that we live in this world of repeat time loops, where all of time is happening at once. Linearity is an illusion that we use to organize our sense of reality, but everything is happening at the same time. And I concluded at the end of my review, and you can read about this, go look it up in the Washington Post. Don't do it now, no phones out. But just so you know, I'm telling you the truth. You can look it up. It's in the Washington Post. I said at the end of the review, Nesmith is right. Reality is weird. Just this past summer, I wrote in the review, I started listening to the Monkees and thinking about the Monkees and reading biographies of the Monkees. And then I have this episode, and seemingly out of the blue, I get this call being told that Mike Nesmith from the Monkees is part of a metaphysical philosophy that I really love and that I'm really attached to. And here I am being asked to write a review of a memoir that makes the very point that I was experiencing. That everything seems to be happening at once, and we make selections. We make selections. And Neville's method, Neville used to say, all things are infinite, all possibilities are simultaneous. You don't manifest, you select. You select. These records weren't destroyed in a fire, you know. You can find them online. You can read about it. Why was I interested in the Monkees? Why did I receive that phone call at that very moment? Did I select one among infinite possibilities, infinite Tuesdays that were all going on at once? It certainly didn't feel at the time. It certainly didn't feel ordinary to me at the time. And I think it's too much of a stretch to say, well, it was just confirmation bias. How could I have possibly arranged these events? Did I reach back in time and make Mike a Christian Scientist? And then reach forward in time and have him write a memoir and arrange to review it just at that moment? Oh, and I got interested in the Monkees back in June and my wife thought I was crazy? I read about all this in the review. You can read it. So I invite you to join the Miracle Club. You don't have to pay anyone. You don't have to join anything. You don't have to tell anyone you're doing it. In fact, it's probably better not to. It's nobody else's business. It's your intimate journey. Let's experiment together. Try it, as Neville would say. Try it tonight. Try it tonight. Prove it in your own experience. See what happens. See what happens. I wish you all the deepest sense of discovery and aspiration. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.